their experience and their background working in education. So Azad is the co-founder of Global School Leaders, a nonprofit that develops effective school leadership to improve the learning of students from marginalized communities around the world. Global School Leaders currently works with partners in India, Indonesia, Kenya, and Malaysia, and they want to improve this program in Latin America. So it's one of the reasons that we invited Azad to share with us what is ESL, but also because I love the background from Azad. He was the founding executive director of the Central Square Foundation. It was the first Indian venture philanthropy fund that currently is investing in an organization looking to improve the quality of student learning. Azad for us is a privilege because when we are talking about venture philanthropy, people try to link venture philanthropy with entrepreneurs. And they ask us, how can I apply venture philanthropy for education programs? So I would love to listen from you, your personal background, what a person like you is being involved with education, how you are promoting Central Square Foundation and right now Global School Leaders, and how you are working in Asian countries and how you are planning to work with us. We invited people, all the people that are that we gathered today are working in education. So that, as I told you, as part of the preparation of this conversation, is the idea is to have a dialogue. So that I will love that you can share with us your experience, your inspiration working in education. How do you link your love for education? How do you link with venture philanthropy? And then you can tell us more about GSL. So thank you very much for being with us. I'm glad to have these wonderful people. Maybe we will have more people entering because we had a problem with the link. I'm seeing here Maria Lopez. And maybe what I can invite is to start with your conversation is that maybe you will have 30 minutes and you will share with us your experience. What is Central Square Foundation, GSL? We also have an image that is a colleague from Azad. So welcome here. He's in Bombay at this moment. So happy that we are connected. We are just a click of distance from you. And to learn more from you. And then we will have a dialogue with all the audience. So we'll have Q&A. So please welcome to listen and to share your concerns, your questions to Azad and to an image. So welcome.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you everyone for joining today. It feels very awkward to be having a conversation in Latin America in English. You know, I did study 2 years of Spanish I did my undergraduate work at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown University. But and I actually have a certificate somewhere that says that I'm proficient in speaking Spanish, but it's first of all, it's been many years, but anyway, apologies for not being able to speak effectively in Spanish or in Portuguese for Greta. So so that's just let me just start out by saying that, and I really appreciate the conversations that we've had with Carolina and Alex going back many years now. I used to be based in India, and when I was running the Central Square Foundation, as Carolina had mentioned, we were quite involved in the startup of the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network. So Nena, who runs that, is a good personal friend, and it's been so incredible to see the growth of the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network, and we certainly hope that Latimpacto can have the same sort of movement across Latin America. And as I talk a little bit with some reflections around philanthropy, I'll touch upon the importance of a network like AVPN or Latimpacto. But let me just start my comments today by saying that many of us are in countries that are facing tremendous hardship due to COVID. And it's many of our team as most of our team is based out of India, and many of them have suffered personal losses in their families and things like this. I'm sure all of you are dealing with the stress of dealing with this unknown trajectory of this disease. So we've just been we're thinking about you and your families, and we hope that everyone is safe and healthy. Uh, COVID has also given us this really interesting opportunity to reimagine education, right? So, I remember a year ago when COVID first hit, I was part of so many webinars where we were talking about, okay, we can reimagine education, which usually meant how do we use technology to further education, because that's what everybody thought that it was ed tech's time. And now it's interesting, as this wave of COVID has come about, like I hear no conversations about reimagining education. In fact, I don't even hear conversations about education so much anymore, which is hugely disappointing. But I do think that now that we have a year of living with COVID and living with school shutdowns and school opening and shutting down again, things like this, we actually now have the experience to really reimagine education. And I think the work that all of you are doing in different ways is so important. And I hope that we can continue a conversation in the education space around how to think about uh, educating all children, because ultimately I think, uh, to me, the reason that I continue to work in education and I'm so passionate about education is because I really think that as humans, not to get too philosophical, but as humans, if we can't even pass along the knowledge that we have now to the next generation, how little have we accomplished, right? So anyway, with that as background, let me talk a little bit. Carolina had asked me to share a little bit about my own journey. So I'll take it all the way back to my great grandfather, who was a teacher. My grandfather was a teacher and a principal. My grandmother was a teacher. My mother was a teacher. My father was a teacher. So I come from a lot of educationists in the family, which meant for many years I have wanted nothing to do with education. But here I am, right? You can try and run from your parents and your history, but you can't run too far eventually. So I grew up mostly in India. I grew up mostly in New Delhi. I went to school there. I was in the US then for university. As I mentioned earlier, I'd done my first degree at Georgetown University on international relations. Following that, the first few years of my career were really around this issue of leadership development. Initially here in the US, I did some work in Africa as well, looking at how one can promote citizen service, volunteer service in South Africa, and then spent many years then working on ideas around leadership development and service in India as well. I spent from that. Then I went into I did my graduate degree at Princeton University in public policy. Spent a couple of years there. I was hoping my colleague, who's now based in Bogota, who was with me at Princeton, would join the call. I hope he's still well. But through that, then I then narrowed my focus onto India, because of the emotional connection. Spent many years fundraising here in the US for development causes in India. Through that, then had the opportunity to think and lead the formation of Central Square Foundation. And as so Central, and I'll touch upon Central Square Foundation, but I spent about 4 years setting that up, getting it going, and I'll talk about that journey and some reflections on that. And then now, about 5 years ago, we set up Global School Leaders, which was to take one of the programs from that we had seed funded at Central Square in India and take it to other countries, other developing countries in the world. So in some ways, it's been a journey of like starting very broad, narrowing a focus, and then broadening it out again. Now, so starting at a very global level around leadership development, narrowing that focus to education in India, and now looking much more broadly again at education globally. So I just want to use that analogy of an hourglass of, you start broad, then narrow, then go broad again, for the structure of what I'm going to speak about today, mostly around education. Yeah. I think there'll be two themes in what I'm going to be talking about. One is the education theme, one is the philanthropy theme. I think both of them are relevant to everybody who's on the call today. Um, so let me just take you to Central Square Foundation. I'll spend a few minutes talking about Central Square Foundation. Uh, so we started Central Square Foundation in 2011. It was one of the first foundations that was Indian money being invested in education in India. So there was a lot of foreign money coming into India to guide education and all of this. So Central Square was one of the first ones, not the first, but one of the first ones to work on education from a strategic perspective. To just give you a little bit of background, India is a very, very vast system. There's 250 million children of school going age in India. So I toss that number out lightly, but that's a lot of children, right? There's 1.5 million schools across the country, 6 million teachers. So so it's a big, a giant beast, right? And for many, many years, the dominant conversation in the education space in India was around how do we get children into schools? So how do we build more schools? How do we get children into schools? And that was the real focus of the education sector for many, many years in India. In 2009, that changed. They passed the Right to Education Act in India in 2009. And that act made it compulsory for children between the ages of 6 and 14 to go to school. And the government was obliged to ensure that a free education was provided to all children between the ages of 6 and 14. So when that happened, that really changed the conversation in the education space in India, because then it went from being a question of access to schools to how do you keep children in schools. So today, most children at some point in India will enroll in school. So the question of access to school is now the less important question. And the more important question is how do you ensure the quality of education in schools so that children remain in school? Because one of the big challenges in India now is that about 50% of children drop out of school before they reach eighth grade, right? So what what kind of an and even getting to eighth grade, most of them, in some of the studies that have been done, most children in above fifth grade can't do some simple division and multiplication and reading words that one would expect in second grade. So there's a huge learning crisis in India, in the sense that children are going to school, but they're not learning. And so when we started Central Square Foundation, it was really at this time when the Indian education system was trying to reorient itself from a situation where we were looking at access to education, to quality of education. And I'm just going to see a Central Square just because I think most of you represent foundations here, and it may give you a little bit of insight into how we thought about it as we embarked on our journey. So when we looked at when we were starting Central Square, the guy who I worked with, he was a private equity guy. So he wanted data, and he wanted to know, okay, like when you look at the data, what does the data tell us about education, and what can we do with that, right? And how can we address that? Um, and as we thought through these solutions, when we were looking at the data, what we felt was that there was really an opportunity to take a venture philanthropy approach where we can say, okay, when we look at the education system analytically, there are all these various ways we can look at it, whether it's ECE or whether it's teacher training, whether it's ed tech, whether it's school governance. There are all these different things that you can do, and what's impactful, what's not. And with that, then we start that's where we started out our journey, and we started out very much as a venture philanthropy group in India. I think some of the initial lessons from Central Square, I'll just go through some initial lessons we learned from our experience with Central Square. One is that, when we were looking at this data to understand what the issues were in Indian education, one of the first things we realized was that the data systems are really weak. So, when people are making decisions about where to invest in education, oftentimes it's based on anecdotal evidence, not so much on systemic evidence, because a lot of the evidence that the government was collecting, or a lot of the data that the government was collecting, was around inputs. So how many schools there are, how many schools have toilets, how many teachers are there, things like that, and very, very little around an orientation to outcomes, which we felt should be where the emphasis is. So one was that data systems are really weak, and there needs to be a lot of investment in understanding what is actually happening in education. The second lesson from starting up Central Square was that, every day in India, there are millions of micro innovations happening, right? So some teacher somewhere is trying something new, some NGO somewhere is trying something new, and this is happening every day. But there are very, very few systems to identify these solutions and to then bring them to grow them and lead them to then systemic change in education. So how, I think, as you think about your work, thinking about how to identify these solutions, and then how to think about what supports are needed to grow these innovations that are happening every day across all of our countries. The third thing we learned at Central Square was that it's not enough to just demonstrate program innovation. There's a very important role around policy that is critical to making sure that these innovations grow, and the policy creates this enabling environment for these innovations to grow. And so I think it's very important for foundations to actually think about their role in policy making, because oftentimes foundations are not thinking about that. They're just thinking about, how do I find interesting projects to fund, and then follow that. But I think foundations really need to invest in the policy component of the work that they're doing. And then finally, the fourth thing that we learned was that it's foundations oftentimes have timelines that are very, very different from the timeline that it takes to make change. So, like in education, for instance, I would say, from my experience, that you can try anything and it'll take at least 3-4 years for it to actually show up in terms of changing children's outcomes, changing that trajectory. And but most conversations, even the conversations we were having at Central Square, were 1 or 2 year conversations. And now that I'm on the NGO side in terms of implementing programs, I've never had a conversation with a foundation which has said, okay, what's your 10-year vision? Like, let's talk about a 10-year vision, as opposed to what do you want to do in the next 2 years. And it's just a very, very different way of thinking. So that's another lesson that we learned, is that you really have to be patient with your investments, because transforming education takes time. Um, I think, just to round out the Central Square story, and then I'll start narrowing the focus into school leadership and what we are doing at Global School Leaders. I think, in terms of where CSF went from starting out with this very venture philanthropy approach, one was that it became important to have very, very clear goals, because you can do a whole range of things, but how do you create an overarching structure which gives you some goals, so that you yourselves feel like you're on the path to meeting some of these goals. So with Central Square, that became foundational literacy and numeracy, which meant that by third grade, how do you get all children to be able to read and do basic numeracy functions by third grade? Because in our experience, what happens after that is, if by third grade the child doesn't know how to read, doesn't know how to do basic math, then everything else becomes incomprehensible as they go forward through the school system. And then the second thing was, as we started to interact with the government with this idea of policy change in mind as well, one of the things we began to realize was that governments have, the education ministries typically will have a wide slate of things that they're working on. And how do foundations then integrate with what the government's priorities are? Because that really increases your ability to get your programs aligned with where the government is putting in money. Because ultimately, you can add up all the foundation's resources, and they just make up a small percentage of a government's budget that the government is spending on education. So ultimately, I think it's very, very important to look at where the government's priorities are, and how philanthropies and NGOs, civil society in general, can be in service to that, while holding the government, of course, accountable for the policies that they're meant to implement. So that's a little bit about Central Square, and happy to take questions in a little bit. I think Carolina had suggested that I just go through the entire talk and then we can have a more of a dialogue. But at Central Square, when we were trying these various things, so we were looking in the beginning at Central Square, we had four verticals. One was around ed tech, one was around teacher training and development, one was around accountability, so government systems for accountability in education. And then one was actually an interesting fact in India is that about 40% of children in India are going to private schools now. So there's 60% of children who go to government-run schools, and the government-run schools tend to cater to the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized. And then the private school sector, which today is catering to about 40% of children, many of those are these low-fee private schools that are charging like $5 to $10 a month. So like if you go into any slum in India, you'll see like in any alley of any slum, you'll see a school there. And these are usually just like a couple of rooms where somebody's doing some teaching and learning and they're calling it a school. But this is what parents are aspirationally. It's important for parents to send their kids to these schools, and that part people in India were not really acknowledging or looking at, because there was this idea that governments are responsible for education. So that was something that we were looking at, and we were really keen to understand how do you support the private sector in education. But one of the things we were finding across all the work that we were doing was that at a policy level, or at like a found like talking about venture philanthropy, we were tossing around all these fancy ideas and terms and language. But when it came down to do these things actually make an impact at the school level, at a child's in the life of a child, that the school leader was a really critical differentiator. So for instance, like the school leader creates a vision for the school. The school leader creates space within the school for teachers to experiment and holds the teacher accountable for this experimentation. School leaders support teachers in their professional development. So all of this we were seeing that in schools where there was a good school leader, we were finding like all these programs we were trying, they would take root in the school. And where there wasn't a good school leader, as long as we were there putting some money into the thing, people would listen to us. And then as soon as we left, the programs would also go away. So when we started to look at this issue of school leadership in India, what we found was that in the government system in India, people were appointed school leaders based on seniority. And in the private system, seniority as teacher, sorry. So if whoever the senior most teacher in the school was automatically promoted to become the head teacher or the principal. And then in the private system, which, as I mentioned, caters to about 40% of the children, whoever set up the school usually functioned as the school principal. So they had to be trained, certified as a teacher, but there was no certification required to be a school leader. And because there was no certification, there was no training that was then provided, because what do you train for if there's no certification that is required? So we felt that it was really important to figure out some way of providing some training to school leaders. So in India today, there's about 7 to 800,000 school principals, and none of them have had, a small percentage at very elite schools have had some training. But other than that, it's been very haphazard, ad hoc training. Like once in a while, you'll get called in, and then the government will tell you, we're running this program, now go out and do it. But it wasn't really training that is on the job professional development, treating them as an individual with great potential to really change children's lives. And so we seed funded the India at Central Square. Then we seed funded the India School Leadership Institute, which was focused on providing on-the-job professional development for school leaders. Uh, when we were setting up the India School Leadership Institute, what we found, we were actually looking at other developing countries to see different models of school principal training. And it was very, very difficult for us to access these models. There's very little literature about them. There was very little that had been written about them or that we could access. So like many other programs in many, many other countries, as we've now discovered, we went to the US, and there was a charter school chain there called KIP, and they had a school leadership development training program that we took and we adapted for the Indian context. And that bit is important because in the school leadership space today, it's really dominated by thinking coming out of the US, coming out of the UK, coming out of Australia and Canada. Basically, these are the countries where a lot of the innovation, a lot of the study is happening in this space. But when we took this program from the States to India, we found we had to do so much adaptation to meet the resource context of India. So just as a couple of quick examples, one is that in India there was a big issue around hitting children in schools, right? Corporal punishment. It had been outlawed under that 2009 law that I had talked about, but there was really no alternative discipline mechanisms that had been introduced into schools. And but this was not something that was discussed at all in the curriculum from the content that we got from KIP, because it was not an issue in the States. So that was something that, like a really practical example of the kinds of things we had to do. But I think at a larger meta level, in terms of the differences, like the KIP program was really driven towards finding excellent people with very high potential as school leaders and investing in them. So you basically develop these lighthouse models of excellence of school leaders who then will show the rest of the system how good school leadership can happen. And that was the philosophy behind that program. And as we thought about it in the Indian context, and as I mentioned, there are 700,000-800,000 school leaders, then like doing this lighthouse model, while it has its benefits, is not necessarily the most relevant thing. What was more relevant was to take the average school leader and bump them up, give them a marginal improvement in their performance, so that then you're reaching a large number of children and trying to improve their education a little bit. Yeah. So so we started this program in 2013, and by 2016 we had scaled the program to 5 Indian cities. We had some partnerships with city governments. The program was on a solid growth path, and we were showing impact on student learning. So what the impact we were showing at the time was, because we were working only with either government schools or very low fee private schools, and what we were showing was that with the investment in the school leader, children who are way below the national average were actually coming closer to the national average. So it wasn't that these children were getting suddenly like excelling in education or anything. It was just a shift closer to the national average, which they were way below when we started working with these schools. So we then decided that it was time to try and uh, see whether there was relevance for this model outside of India, because we began to realize that this is an issue that is, when you look at the global education ecosystem, and so I think Augustine, you were earlier talking about hatching conspiracies, but so if you talk about the global education system, there's very little conspiracy, so to speak, around school leaders, right? People will look straight at teachers. Okay, we need to invest in teachers, or they'll think about like we need much better policies at a high level. But how do you translate that between like either changes at the policy level or the teacher level? And that's the school leader that creates that connection, right? So we wanted to see whether there was relevance of this Indian model outside of India. And that's when we started Global School Leaders, because we wanted the India program to have its own path. And then we created Global School Leaders as a separate organization to take this India model and see whether it was adaptable for other countries. So that's how Global School Leaders is formed. And so now I'll talk a little bit about Global School Leaders. And we were really, as global school leaders, we really think about local action informed by a global perspective, right? So what is happening in the world around school leadership, and how do we translate that into contextualized programs within countries that make sense for the country, that are locally led within countries, and are responding to local needs, local education needs. So we broadly think about our work in two large buckets. One is on the training side. So how do we look at the most effective ways of training school principals? The second bucket is really around how do we create the enabling environment for school leaders to excel, through systems and policy change. So it's not just enough to train a school principal. You have to look at who's becoming a school principal, how are they becoming a school principal, what support do they get, what incentives are there, how much are they aligned with with the education system's goals, and all of this, right? So there's two broad buckets, as I mentioned. So there's the training bucket and the policy bucket that we work on. I think in terms of training, we our view is that the most effective training for school leaders is on the job training, so continuous professional development. So many countries have pre-service training programs for school principals. So before you become a principal, you get training on what you have to do as a principal. But then once you're in the job, then you don't really have much support. And we really believe that the best way to support school leaders is through continuous professional development. So we have three aspects to the training program. One is the content and the curriculum. So what are these activities that school leaders can do that actually drive learning outcomes for students? So we've actually condensed that now into what we call these 6 high leverage leadership activities, which part of which is focused on instructional leadership. So the idea there being, how do you get the school principal out of their office into the classroom to support teachers to then teach children better, which then leads to children's learning outcomes improving. So that's the instructional leadership bit. Because, like, for instance, in India, and in many of the other countries in which we work now, the school leader just typically will sit in the office all day long. There'll be people coming into the office. So whether it's a vendor, whether it's a parent, whether it's a child, whether it's teachers, but they themselves don't get out of the office much. And we really think that they need to be much more hands-on in terms of going into the classroom to see what's actually happening in their schools, and then working with teachers to then improve the quality of education that's being delivered. Um, the second area that we look at in the instructional leadership, in the content bucket, is this leadership for equity. So as I mentioned, all the schools we work with are really focused on children from marginalized backgrounds, and they come to school with a whole range of issues, right? It could be violence in the home, it could be poverty, it could be health challenges, all of these, and they all bring that into the school. And what we want is that school leaders should believe that all children can learn, regardless of where they come from. And to make that happen, school leaders need to understand, first of all, what the challenges of the child are, or what the challenges of each child are in the school, so that they can then create the environment in the school where each child is focused on. And that's a leadership for equity bucket that we have. So there's two strands to the training. One is the instructional leadership, one is the leadership for equity. And so that's in the content that we deliver. In addition to, the other thing that we do that I think is really important is the coaching aspect. So in addition to providing the content, we also have work with coaches. So each school leader then, following the workshop, gets a coach visit in the school, where then they help them work through some of these challenges that they have in implementing these concepts that they're being told. And then finally, there's this the idea of community. So school leadership is as all of you know, as leaders, leadership is a lonely profession. So, everybody comes to you with their problems, and oftentimes there isn't a peer network to share these ideas with. So this community that we create among the school leaders who are part of our program also tends to be very, very impactful. So we are now, so that's sort of a little bit about the content of the work that we do. And we, as Carolina had mentioned in the beginning, today we are working we have deep programs in, the India program, of course, continues. We're also working in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Kenya. And then during COVID, we've had some lighter touch partnerships in Nigeria, Uganda, and the Philippines. And we're starting something in Peru, which I'll talk about when we talk about our thinking about Latin America. But at a broad level, just on this issue of school leadership, what have we found so far? One is that school leadership is very, very important, as I mentioned earlier. It's very tricky to work on, but there is research now that shows how cost effective it is. And also that during this COVID time, we're seeing this really important role of leadership and seeing the difference between schools where there has been good leadership and where there hasn't been good leadership. So in our experience, when we look at schools and we see, okay, this school had a good school leader, then you have a sense that uh, the school leader is trying things to take care of the children, whether it's their physical or emotional needs, to take care of their learning needs. So when COVID hit, we were finding that there was school leaders were being asked to do a lot, right? So governments were saying, okay, shut down your schools. Okay, now start doing remote teaching. Now start caring for the emotional well-being of children, and all of these things were things that school leaders didn't necessarily know how to do. So I think what we're seeing in this time is that leadership is so important. And I think certainly at a broad level, we're seeing it in various countries, where the country level, where there's strong leadership, you're having good responses to COVID. And I think you can see that also at the school level. So that's one thing, is the importance of school leadership. I think the second thing is that um, there are these cross-cutting themes that emerge across countries. So while we are very much driven by the idea of being responsive to local needs and local leadership driving the program as it's implemented across countries, there are very there are some there are a whole bunch of sort of cross-cutting themes that exist across these countries. So just to touch on a couple, one is this issue of school leader supervisor. So every country in which we work, sitting above the school principal in the systems, there'll be a school leader supervisor. They're called different things in different countries. But how do you engage that level? Because when you think about embedding school leadership programs in the government, that level becomes very critical. And there's been very little work done on understanding that level and how to really activate that level to make it most effective. The second thing is that there are very few countries have a formal framework for school leadership. So I know, for instance, in Brazil, we know that they're just looking at that framework. I think in Colombia, they just passed a framework, or they've just adopted a framework. But in many countries, you're in a sense shooting in the dark when you're trying to do school leadership training, because there isn't a definition of what the role has to be. So, for instance, in India, India just passed a new national education policy. So it came out last year. And in that, it's a long document. It's about 200 pages or something like this. There's no section on school leadership. So school leadership is touched upon in various sections, but there is no focus on school leadership. So then, how do you, like, when you've not defined the role of this critical leader in the system, how do you actually expect to influence that lever? I think the third thing that we've learned so far is that this replication of ideas coming out of the north, global north, or the US, UK, countries like that, is happening across the world, right? So every country, when they start to think about what do we want to do in school leadership, they're going straight to the same people, asking them for their resources, and then going through the same process of adapting these resources to their own country's needs. And there's very little knowledge sharing that's happening, because the forums for that to happen don't really exist. They're beginning to emerge, but they don't really exist today. So I think this idea of how do you introduce some efficiency to this replication of ideas is something that we're finding. And yeah, so let me stop there in terms of global school leaders and our work, and just touch really quickly upon Latin America, because we've been looking, in the beginning, Spanish was too high a hurdle for us to overcome. Now we feel like, okay, we know enough to be able to interact with countries and have something meaningful to offer. Largely, we've had discussions with people in Peru and Argentina and Brazil and Colombia and Chile and Mexico, just to understand what's happening. Because one of the things we found was that as you dig into education systems, you find that there are things that are happening with school leaders, but it's sometimes it's not captured, sometimes it's not clear. To just explore this, we've been having a bunch of conversations in different countries in Latin America to understand what's happening. So in Peru, so I'll just go through where we actually have we've had some meaningful conversations in terms of where we understand a little bit about the system. So Peru, a few years ago, had revamped the selection system for school principals. We're now working with the Ministry of Education in Peru, with the World Bank, to actually run a curriculum around school reopening for school leaders. So as I had mentioned earlier, in response to this idea that school leaders are being given a lot of direction but not much guidance for this COVID time, we created a curriculum that is meant to guide school leaders through these times. So it looks at both caring for children in terms of emotional well-being, things like how do you do remote teaching and learning, how do you prepare for future emergencies that may come. So that's really the focus of that curriculum. So that we're implementing in Peru in partnership with the Ministry of Education and the World Bank there. In Argentina, we've been having a number of conversations with the Varki Foundation there, and the sister organization, Comunidad Ateneo. And that's been a really interesting conversation because they've done some fairly large scale programs in Argentina around school leadership. We've also been having a number of conversations in Brazil. Obviously the Leman Foundation in Brazil is a big player in the space, in education in general, but they've had a long history of looking at school leadership. So through them, we've been talking to various different organizations. I'm assuming most of you on this call will know that Brazil recently introduced this BNCC, which is a national curriculum, which was supposed to introduce national standards for curriculum across the country. And with that, now they're trying to develop school leadership frameworks that match what they're trying to roll out in the curriculum. So we've been in conversations with a number of different groups about potentially setting up a training program in Brazil. And then finally in Colombia, we've had a couple of conversations with Empresarios por la Educación, and it's been really interesting to hear about the potential for how the government is thinking about school leadership in Colombia and the steps that they're taking to meet that. There is a paper which I will share with you. I'm not technically, well, maybe I can just try it. But there is a paper that just came out from the World Bank. So there's two people at the World Bank who've been looking at school leadership in Latin America. There's a woman called Melissa Edelman and a woman called Renata Limos. And they have just issued a publication around school leadership in the Caribbean and Latin American countries. I'll share a link for this in a second. So that's something, and that paper talks about three things that can happen in Latin America, that need to happen in Latin America. One is around strengthening selection processes, so making the processes less political and making it more competency based. The second is around training, support, and incentives. So how do we introduce more structured training programs that are aligned to meeting the needs of school leaders? And then the third is aligning systems goals. So making sure that what the school leader is responsible for is also what it somehow translates up into what the national governments are saying are the goals of the education system. So that comes from that paper, and I'll definitely share that link to you. So now, so we started at a broad level in India, then I talked a little bit about GSL, and then I'll quickly, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'll quickly just touch upon just what we are thinking about as we now sit with this very narrow lens on school leadership, but what do we see? How does it impact the larger education system? One is on school leadership. One is, how do school leaders really impact learning outcomes, right? So we know anecdotally that they have an impact, but we don't know specifically, okay, what are the actions that really drive learning outcomes for children? Because the way to measure is so difficult, right? Because you're saying, okay, we're going to give an input to the school leader. The school leader will then have some impact on the teacher, then the teacher will have some impact on children. And so how do you track that continuum of action to make sure to understand then, are student outcomes improving? If they are, what happened with the school leader to make that change happen? Yeah. The second is that now we're increasingly seeing these various things, these various global priorities around education. We're seeing now in the introduction of thinking around school leadership and their impact on this. So things like, say, like I'll just touch upon two things, right? So one is there's this big conversation now around non-academic social
Exactly.
emotional learning, right? How do you get children to be not just educated people, but citizens, right? Who have the ability to, not just know content, but also function as well as citizens. So, what is the role of school leaders in introducing that in schools, right? So, if you were to ever introduce a social emotional learning curriculum in a school, it would have to be the school leader who's creating that space for that to happen. I know some of you here on the call are interested in early childhood education. So in that again, just anecdotally on that, the funny story. So when you go to schools, these low cost private schools that I've been talking about, uh, whenever we go into these schools, we see that the nicest room in the school is the early child, is the first entry grade into the school, whatever that is. That's the nicest room in the school, because that's what parents will come to see, right? So that's, and the schools want to capture the kids as early as they can. And so it's interesting, but school leaders don't really know what good ECE is, right? So because parents are coming in with 3-year-old kids demanding that the kids be taught alphabets, that they be taught like all this stuff, whereas we know that the literature says, you know, from 3 to 5, it's just about like broad skills and just developing the ability to think and motor skills and things like that, and not like how to do, like learn the alphabet and learn numbers. So again, that's a leadership challenge, right? How do you get school leaders to think about this? And then I think the third thing that we've been thinking about broadly is, um, in the context of schools, it feels like the purpose of schools is changing. This is just my opinion, but it feels like schools have been asked to become, or have been asked to reclaim their role in the community as community institutions that are addressing not just the education needs of children, but really the holistic needs of the community. And how do you prepare school leaders to rethink their role as the role of schools changes as well? So that's something that we've been thinking about. How do you spark this dialogue around what is the changing role of schools, and then along with that, how does leadership play into that changing role of schools? I had said that uh, uh, the last sort of formal stuff that I want to talk about is, I when I was at Central Square Foundation, I was in the grant making side. Now, for the last 5 years, I've been on the grant seeking side, and so it's been quite interesting to see sort of how that has played out in my life, and the way I've been thinking about philanthropy and the role of civil society and things like this. And I think broadly, I would say three things. One is this move towards strategic philanthropy, right? So how do we move from saying, okay, like all we're going to do is build classrooms, or we're going to like fund scholarships, just very reactionary things, that to more thinking about philanthropy's role in creating public goods, right? So how does philanthropy think of itself as creating the enabling conditions uh, for children to thrive? And that, I think, groups like AVPN, like Latin Pacto, are really critical to uh, creating the collective thinking around that, right? Because it's very difficult for an individual foundation to go out and say, okay, we're going to start thinking strategically when nobody else is doing that around them. So I think that's where like these networks are so important for philanthropies to be able to talk to each other around this. I think the second broad shift that I think is really needed in the philanthropy space is around the timelines on which we work. So uh, how do we get foundations to increasingly start thinking about 7-10 year horizons as their horizons for change, as opposed to, how I'm just thinking about my annual budget and how do I get my budget out, and like how do I just get like a 1 or 2 year thing where I'm seeing like the impact in 1 or 2 years. And not that NGOs shouldn't be held accountable on an annual basis for what they're supposed to be doing, but how do philanthropies have this conversation over a longer term with NGOs? And then finally, I would just say the last thing I think is that philanthropies really need to rethink their role beyond just funding, right? So, how do philanthropies partner with NGOs in a meaningful way to create the systemic change that we all eventually want to see happen, right? We may differ upon what the systemic change actually is that we want to see, but how do philanthropies play a much more active role in that? So, for instance, like our work in Kenya is funded by a foundation called Wellspring, which is based out of New York, and they work with around 50 to I think it's 50 organizations across East Africa in 3 countries, and they then created something called the Regional Education Learning Initiative, where they bring together very deliberately all their partners who work on education to really have them think together around, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve in education, and what is each of our roles to play in meeting those goals. So I think that's again this idea of philanthropy beyond funding, thinking about how they can play a role. So anyway, so that's a lot I've thrown at you. I did want to finish my remarks by just personalizing all this, right? So I mean, we all talk in these big ideas, but we last year towards the end of last year, we ran a program in India and Kenya, which was around orienting school leaders to girls' education. So during COVID, in many countries, there's a big fear, definitely in India and Kenya, that we lose a lot of the girls we've brought into the education system, because during COVID, girls have had to take more responsibility in the home. There's spending a lot more time on caring for siblings while parents are out working. We know that girls in general in these countries have differential access to technology and all this, right? So there's a big digital divide in terms of gender, in terms of access to technology, which will then, we think, will lead to girls dropping out of school in the coming years, because they don't have the consistency in their education experience over the last year. We through this we did this program around exposing school principals to these ideas around girls' education, how to create, how to first of all bring girls back into schools, but b how do you create more gender responsive schools going forward. And in these sessions now, one of the things that we get to do is we get to sit in on sessions in different parts of the world, and it's really interesting to see how this is happening, how these training programs happen in different parts of the world. Through this, I met this school leader called Jaya Lakshmi. I'll just call her Jaya for the purpose of this. And her story was just so amazing, and to me it captured so much about what we're trying to do. Jaya was born to, her mom was 14 when she had Jaya. So her mom was a teenage mom essentially, which is not unusual at all. And Jaya was one of 5 children in her family. She was born into a low caste family in India. So in India, as you know, there's a caste system, and the lower castes are the most marginalized people in India. And she was born into one of these families. And when she was 12, her mom, and this is all a story she's telling, right? So you just have to imagine Jaya telling me the story, and not me. But when she was 12, her mom was sick. Her mom got really sick, and she had to quit school to take care of her family. So she was 12 and she was taking care of her 4 siblings. But she really had this desire to continue her education. So she convinced her parents to let her finish her education till 10th grade, because that's the first grade in India at which you take an exam, a national exam, and then that leads you into like your 11th and 12th grade, which then leads you to college. Um, so in order to do that, she had to do her household chores early in the morning, take care of it at night, but during the day she was unable to continue her education. She graduated top of her class in 10th grade. And But then after 10th grade, her parents said, okay, now you have to go get married. So when she was 16, she went and got married. And But interestingly, at that point, her dad's a boss who I don't remember what her dad did, but he was like a daily wage laborer of some kind. And her dad's boss had found out that she had done really well in 10th grade and pressured the parents to get her to continue her education. So she did that. She ends up going to college, becomes a teacher, and then for the last 25 years, she'd been a school leader. And in this role now, in this, and it's so amazing to sit and think like after 25 years, for the first time, she's now having conversations that allow her to reflect upon her own journey as a woman to a position of school leadership, and also the influence that she can have on so many girls' lives as a school leader. So it was super inspiring for us to hear this story, and I just wanted to bring her story to this forum, to just highlight the impact that school leaders have on the larger community around them. So sorry for going on for so long. I hope it all made sense. And I would be happy to take the conversation wherever you want to take it now.
Asad, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to listen to you and to learn from you. So I will invite the audience to ask some questions. Lore, did you raise your hand? Ah, okay, you're clapping. Okay. But welcome to ask a question. I'm seeing here a comment from Agustin. He's recommending another institution working in New Jersey. Agustin, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Azad, thank you very much. I agree with you. Leadership, we very barely focus on leaders of the schools. And in my experience, when I visit rural schools, it was very clear that when you have a good principal, the school were running very well and the teachers were engaged and doing the things they should do. And when you go to a school where the principal is just there as administrator and doesn't feel really leader of that group, the work doesn't work as good. So I totally agree with you. I don't understand why we don't think sometimes in the same way when we think about businesses. And we know that the executive director is fundamental to run a very good company and everything. So I don't know why we don't translate those principles into a school as simple as that. Another way, I see very interesting how to train leaders of the schools. And in my way, I have find out, I don't know you have heard of them, but there is a very interesting program called Uncommon Schools in New Jersey.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, well, I
Yes.
think that's another beautiful program of how they train their teachers and their leaders and how they use data for keeping the good level of schools they have there, and also the motivation they do for students to fix their or not to fix but to talk to their personal problems, as you mentioned in your presentation at the beginning, how to deal with that in their way of doing it, so they can leave that aside or manage to incorporate that into their development. So but my question is, and I would like to make a question, is how is that uh, we can invest. I mean, I know you have to look into leadership, and that's a big issue for investing or giving grants to schools and working on that. It would be, well, how to manage this part of transitioning from, I would say, uh, how can I say that? Let me the part of I would like to see how lot much more money going into school systems. And we have a debate here in Monterrey right now about that. How are we are gonna do what the government is not doing, and how to really, what is your experience of thinking of helping foundations, business leader to invest for a 10-year, 15-year program to see changes? Because that's the point. I mean,
Yeah.
how to turn around. We know that if we invest in schools, by every grade we raise schooling, the GDP grows also. So, I mean, for me, so logical, but I think the point is how to make this happen from the business leaders or the foundations to have that long-term view.
Yeah. Thanks, Augustine. I should say for me too, like a lot of the motivation for continuing this work is just sort of this uh, what I see as an illogical approach to education. So when I look at the business world and how much is invested in training and how much is invested in leadership development in the business world, and then you see how little is invested on in the education side, on the leadership side, it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever, right? And it doesn't make sense to me that business leaders who prioritize leadership development within their companies, when they look at schools, don't look at that. So I'm not sure I have an answer to the second part of to your question. I think in general, what we found is there's a couple of things. One is in terms of the cost effectiveness, there's now some interesting data coming out. In fact, there was a very interesting study out of Brazil that was looking at that actually measured that for a 5% increase in for a 5% shift of budgets in the education to leadership development, it resulted in a 30% increase in learning outcomes. So I think there needs to be a lot more data around, and I can share that study as well with you also. It's not a study that we did, but it's a study that was done in Brazil. And I think part of it is just this idea that there isn't data around this, right? So we haven't measured these things. And so how do we, as we start to measure these things, as we start to increase the data that's available around this, then that will lead to hopefully more of a business orientation to thinking about how do we look at the education system over the longer term, and how do we orient it towards reaching the quality outcomes that we want.
Thank you, sir.
Lore and Manolo.
Thank you. The first hands were clapping, so first, Azad, thank you for your generosity, for sharing such a rich journey of commitment. And my question goes regarding something that you said at the beginning, how you found these cycles of investing on leadership and then on programs and then leaderships. And you mentioned also how important is our role in policy making, because we want to enable the environment for change to happen, right? So how do you approach your board, which probably is putting pressure on you on giving results in a short term, and they say focus on programs, focus on deliveries, and like let someone else focus on leadership and policy and let government do their job, right? If you have found these cycles operating, which recommendations and narratives would you suggest in to really stick on that? I mean, we believe the same, but in a complex context as ours, where policies and the collaboration with government gets a little bit complicated. How do we make those jumps, especially with the board?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think, one of the things I would just say is that if you talk to, so for foundations that have been on this path, or at least what we are finding is that for foundations that have been on this quality of education journey for a few years, it's when you say to them, oh, school leadership is important, they say, of course, we know that because we've seen that in our own journey, right? And I think it's so I think there's some amount. I mean, part of it would be to actually look at and actually it's an interesting idea for us to do around looking at foundations that have invested in school leadership, to gather their journeys, right? To say, okay, why did you decide to do this, and what have you found over the past? There's not that many foundations, by the way, that look at school leadership in general, right? So I think I can probably, for foundations that have a very specific focus on school leadership, I can probably count on one hand around the world foundations that have a very specific interest in school leadership. So it maybe it's a good idea for us to think about like actually capturing the stories of those foundations, because it is a very consistent journey where foundations will try a number of different things, and then they'll say, okay, this is something that's missing, and so we must invest in that. But I think in terms of the larger question, I think uh, I think there's enough evidence now that shows that all that we've done in the last 10, first of all, because of COVID, I think there's a very real fear that all the gains we made in the last 20 years in education are all going to go away, because children, there's going to be tremendous pressure on children to economically, there's tremendous pressure on children emotionally, and there's, and frankly, our education systems are failing children, right? Like, what does it mean to go to school in India today when 50% of kids are not reaching eighth grade, right? And you don't, like, you need a 10th grade education to get even the most basic of jobs. So with an eighth grade education, you like that education doesn't prepare you for, doesn't even give you the paper that's required to get most formal jobs, right? So I think if we were to honestly look at the work that we've done over the last 20 years as actors in the education systems, we would have to acknowledge the fact that while there has been a lot of progress in some ways, in many ways, there's a long, long way still to go. And if we were to honestly look at that and say, okay, what do we need to do to improve this? Then we could have some really interesting conversations. But I think as long as the conversation is still stuck at like, okay, can I provide scholarships to kids to go to school? We're not going to have that change in the conversation. So I don't know if I answered your question properly, Lorena, but I'd be happy to, I think it's a much larger discussion, which I'd be happy to continue after the call as well.
Thank you so much, Azad.
Manolo, please welcome.
Yes, thank you, Carolina, and thank you, Azad. Really a privilege to have you here today and share with us your experience. I think we're already on time to finish, Carolina, but I have so many questions given the fact that we have been investing in early childhood centers in Mexico, and we have moved from B2C to B2B, and pivoting the model, and you have made so many comments about early childhood education, and the comment you made about early childhood rooms in schools being the nicest. I didn't know that the school system have their own early childhood rooms within their schools, and preschooling here in Mexico it's a bit different. But I think that in order not to go beyond the time, I would like to ask you if it will be possible for us as a group to connect with you and ask you some very specific questions, because I think there are many, and I just don't want to spend.
No, absolutely, absolutely, Manola. Thank you for your comment. And I just want to say, because I know that there are people on this call who are interested in early childhood education. So I've personally had a very long interest in this. So in India, we were looking at this, not connected to the GSL work, but through Central Square, we were looking at early childhood education, and it's such a massively underinvested in area, right? India has the Integrated Child Development Services Scheme, which is the largest early childhood program in the world. There's something like, I don't know, there's many, many millions of kids who go through that. And what we found with that was that, the health and the nutrition outcomes on that were really good, but the education outcomes were very poor, which was then causing children to come into school already at a loss compared to peers who had been through early childhood programs. And then, starting from that, last year we actually, and I'd be happy to share this with you as well, Manolo, anybody on this call who's interested in EC, we did a conversation around early childhood education with a few, because we were really interested in this issue of leadership in the early childhood education space, because in many countries it's the early childhood system is separated from the education system, right? So you go through an early childhood system, then you go to the education system. So in India, for instance, the early childhood education system sits under the Ministry of Women and Child Development. And then the education system it used to be called the Ministry of Human Resource Development, and then now it's called, I think, the Ministry of Education or something. But they were very separate funding streams. The goals were not aligned. So all of this, right? All of these challenges. So we were trying to see, okay, if this is indeed happens across many countries, then how are leaders in the early childhood system being prepared for their role, right? Because like, what is good EC? How do you run an EC center? All these questions are very, very pertinent. How do you engage parents effectively? So we did a conversation around that, and I'd be happy to share some of the learnings from that with you. There's a few, so I'll be happy to share that with you.
Thank you, Sad. Yes, and also we will share the recording link and some takeaways, because we had some problems with the link. So maybe we will connect with other people that could not attend this webinar today. And Lucia Rivera, thank you for joining us. We are aware that you had a problem with the link, and so Pilar from Barkey Foundation. So apologize for this problem that we had with the link.
Carolina, could I ask?
Yes, sure.
Maybe I can ask a question too, but the people on this call who I have no idea who they are.
Yes, please,
and it would
they
be
can
really,
introduce
really
themselves. Yes,
interesting to
sure.
get some thoughts that what people are thinking from this conversation. So I know some people had introduced themselves in the beginning, but maybe if others who hadn't had a chance to speak can at least share who they are and what they're thinking coming out of this, that'd be really
sure. So I will invite maybe Pilar from Barkey Foundation. That is, Pilar, welcome. And because we are aware that you are one of the partners of Azad in Argentina.
Yeah, definitely. We are working a lot with them. My name is Pilar Andres. I work at the Barkey Foundation at the office that the foundation has in Argentina. And from here, we have many training programs, mainly for school principals in Latin America. Of course, as Azad told, we have this program and this conversation with them about school principals training. And then we are both organizations leading a new leadership thematic group that this is part of the teacher task force from UNESCO that will be around school leadership. That I appreciate the time to let you know that we are launching this initiative, and if you want to join, you are more than welcome.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Pilar. We have also Lucia, Leonardo, Antonio Fonseca. Welcome. Antonio? Antonio is from Fundación Eugenio Mendoza in Venezuela, working with Luisa Mariana Pulido. And Leonardo, please, welcome.
Hi, good morning. I'm based in the Netherlands with a team of Fundación Mendoza. Thank you for the invitation. I also wanted to comment on the program on the early childhood segment. I have visited several countries in Latin America. I know that the difficulty to keep sustainable centers, in particular in this time with the COVID, that somehow forced to the kind of programs that we have been supporting there that are based on home visiting. Some even go far as to attend children beyond the early childhood years. Is something that you can comment on that, how sustainability has been a challenge for this initiative?
You mean for the work that we are doing, or for, sorry?
Yeah.
It's a huge challenge. I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, you know, I think foundations find it very hard to wrap their minds around like the time that it takes to show the impact and all this. So it's a lot of conversations, a lot of, you know, getting people to see the bigger picture. So it's not, and ultimately, you know, a lot of people have told us that, you know, you should think of the government as your ultimate client, right? Because the government ultimately will be the ones who decide that, okay, these are the qualifications that are needed for a school leader. This is the training program that's required. And so so that's why for us that the work on the policy side also becomes important, because ultimately you want the governments to be able to set aside a certain portion of their budget for school leader training as well. So for instance, in India, Leonardo, there's the budgets for professional development in the education space are all focused on teachers. And there was, so even in terms of thinking about, okay, is there a line item in the government budget around school leader training? That didn't exist either. And now, like, for instance, and it creates these problems that are illogical, right? So as I mentioned in that national education policy that was adopted in India last year, there was a mandate that school leaders should have 50 hours of training every year. But there's nowhere does it talk about the money that would be required for that, where that money would come from. So I think, I mean, sustainability is a huge challenge in general. And that's, I think, part of the reason why we work so hard on the policy side, to make sure that eventually there are funding streams that go towards innovations in education that have been shown to have impact as well.
Sorry to add a bit more, but I had the chance, the privilege to work with in India, in Gujarat and Orissa.
Yeah.
And actually, the big challenge we have there with, let's say, services for children that were not directly supported by government, was that we couldn't go to scale, and was difficult to get with the, say, with the local Gujarati, or to get the support needed to bring these experiences to all the vulnerable population. Is that the challenge that you face every day? How is something you have in mind? We are thinking about how we can do something in Latin America that could be based part of on the local economy. But we know the challenge, or I know the challenge in India. And I wonder if there's something that you have discovered, some kind of hints that you can give us about how to solve that. That
I think this question of scale, I mean, I'd love to have like an hour and a half conversation with all of you on this call around scale, because, you know, that's something that I've thought about a lot in terms of what do we, I mean, we toss the term around very lightly, right? Or we have to go to scale, or, you know, we aspire to scale, or things like this. But what does that actually mean, and how do you actually do that? These are very, very important questions. So our approach has been that scale eventually will come through the government. So how do you work with the government, and how do you work with the government to make sure that they are a part of, so you can't design programs that don't necessarily fit in with the government infrastructure, right? So and it's always challenging, because the government won't let you come in unless you can show that you've done something. Then when you've done something, then it's not big enough. So all of this, right? But what we found, and what I've seen with other programs as well that have had impact, is that you begin your design phase by accounting for what the government system is in this space, right? So if you don't do that, and you say there's a better way to do it, and we're going to come up with this fancy new model and all this, then it never takes root outside of that. So I think, you know, for us, like, the idea that we are designing all of our programs in different countries based on what the government priorities are, like that, and also recognizing the government's resources has been very, very important to us. But it's a very tricky challenge, and as I said, it would be lovely to have a conversation with all of you about that.
Thank you, Seth. So the time is short. We're ending this, but what we can do is that we can share with, if you allow us to share your email address, so the people
Yes,
that
please.
that have interest to continue this conversation, we can share your email, and we will also share the recorded link, the takeaways. And I hope that once we have our annual conference next year, after we overcome this crisis, you can also join us. It will be a pleasure to have a coffee with you, to share with our community, and to continue learning from you. So thank you very much, Azad. It has been a pleasure. It has been a wonderful an hour and a half. And I'm sure that we will continue in touch. We will continue learning from you. And you are always welcome to be part of Latin Impact, our community of philanthropists and social investors, to promote a better impact. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carolina. And I really appreciate everyone's time and attention on the call. I wasn't sure how people would
No, and apologize because we had a
receive
problem
this.
with the link.
So yeah, no. So I'm so happy that people are interested in this and would love to carry on a conversation. So you can, I put my email in the chat, and then, I'd referenced a couple of studies. So what I'll do is I'll share that with Carolina, and then
Thank you. And we'll share
Carolina
it with the
can share that with you.
takeaways. Thank you very much, Azad.
Thank you so much. Have a great day,
Thank
everyone.
you, everyone. Have a
Take
great
care.
day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Good to
Bye.
see you.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you, all of you.